This is CB Up for Discussion, a podcast series from Community Business where we tackle DE&I and wellbeing hot topics with special guests from across Asia. Hello, I'm Emily Moss, Head of Social Impact at Community Business, and I'll be your podcast host for this episode. Today, we are delighted to be up for discussion with Janet Ledger, our CEO here at Community Business. Breaking from our usual format a little bit, Janet is sitting on the other side of the table in order to share insights from the UN 68th Annual Commission on the Status of Women, which she attended in March in New York on behalf of Community Business. The CSW is the largest annual gathering on gender equality and women's empowerment and brought together governments, civil society, experts and activists from across the world to agree actions and investments that can end women's poverty and advance gender equality. We're excited to hear what Janet took away from the event and hopefully hear her insights that can help move the needle on gender equality in Asia. Janet, thank you for joining us on Up for Discussion.
Thanks, Emily. You're welcome. It's quite odd being on this side of the table. But no, it's great to be able to share the experience. So the Commission for the Status of Women is the principal intergovernmental body that's dedicated to the promotion of gender equality and empowerment of women globally. And they work with all of the member states in the UN to come up with various different programs. And the theme for this year, the priority theme for the year, was accelerating the achievement of gender equality and the empowerment of all women and girls by addressing poverty, strengthening institutions and financing with a gender perspective. They had a secondary theme that was a review theme, and that was from the CSW68 when they were looking back on how they've progressed. And that was about covering, it was around social protection systems, access to public services, and sustainable infrastructure for gender equality and the empowerment of women. So that was also a key theme. How it works is you have the member states and all of the UN accredited NGOs in the grounds at the UN. And in parallel, the NGO CSW68 is run in 3 venues in and around the UN. And the NGO CSW is a coalition of civil organisations and individuals that are principally concerned with gender equality and rights and the empowerment of women and girls. And they come together to share information and bridge the gap between civil society and grassroots organisation and governmental organisations. Essentially, they're lobbying the delegates that are in the UN, and about half of the delegates at any given time in the NGO CSW were also literally just sort of jumping in and out of the 2 different events. Over 750 free events are held over the time. They're hosted and attended by over 15,000 people, and 139 countries participate and over 5,000 organisations. So the scale was huge. In conjunction with our GIDA partners, Community Business also hosted an event, and that was around Centering Marginalised Voices. And I also then had the opportunity to attend as many of the events as I could possibly get around to.
Great. And just before we kick off, can you just remind everyone listening about GIDA and our involvement?
Yeah, sure. So this time last year in New Zealand, we launched the GIDA partnership, and it had been, about 18 months in the making. So it's the Global Inclusion and Diversity Alliance, and we're a founding member. It also includes Diversity Works New Zealand, the Centre for Diversity and Inclusion in Canada, and DCA Australia. We'll look to grow that partnership with other global organisations. So we're doing an event with them in July around allyship. But yeah, we were there with all of our GIDA partners to do a presentation.
Great, thank you. And I think we'll obviously go into some granularity in a minute, but I guess in terms of broad strokes, what would you say were the biggest takeaways from the conference? And particularly, what can we in Asia and in the DE&I space here learn from global partners?
So in the spirit of SDG 17, Partnership for Goals, to actually present at the conference in an event, you had to do that with other NGOs. There were no single events run by just one organisation. So every single event I attended was a collaboration of in some cases up to 4 or 5 NGOs in the one room. You also had a lot of funders present, so it was it may well have been funders and NGOs presenting on what changes need to occur in funding models. So that was certainly a learning for me. A strong message was around the funders who were talking about the importance of working with the people on the ground with the lived experience. The other piece, which I guess we know, is the importance of partnering with men, and how you actually bring programs to life where you're taking men on the journey in terms of empowering women and girls. A lovely analogy that I heard in one session around partnership was one person can walk really fast, but a group of people can walk a really long way, which I thought that really landed with me. And another was also the power of messy organisations and loose connections around partnerships, that it doesn't have to be sort of really structured, and it doesn't, that you can actually, you get more creativity sometimes out of the mess. And then I guess the message that really spoke to me also about partnering is partnering and not competing. That you get way better outcomes if you're actually finding common goals that you're both working towards and finding ways to tease out the way to get the right outcome. It was also really inspiring to be around so many diverse organisations and individuals. It felt like a really safe environment. Sort of like the egos were parked at the door, and it was just a really great learning space to hear everybody's ideas in terms of showcasing the work, as opposed to, and it wasn't actually not about showcasing the work, it was about sharing learnings. So it was a very learning environment, and I've touched on the size and scale of it. But what was interesting is that there are a lot of presenters as well where there's a level of frustration about how slow achieving the SDG goals are. There are numbers bandied about, which we would have also heard, we're up to 300 years before you've got equity, to 160 years before there's equity. And so a consensus around a lot of the NGO delegates is that we're just not moving fast enough and that more needed to be done.
And I suppose that's interesting in that, the messy kind of, if we're going to get there, we can't be perfect all the time, right? So it all feeds into each other, which is really interesting. Great. Well, thank you for that context. When we've talked off camera about this conference, you mentioned the recurring theme of intersectionality. And specifically what I remember you kind of explaining was the discussion around intersecting and interconnected nature of the economic situation that we're in globally, the care crisis and the climate crisis. So could you expand a little bit on this? Because I think that's quite an interesting theme.
Yeah, so, I know typically we talk about ESGs and SDG goals in the work we do, and we've got a really heavy emphasis on the S, on the social, but there were running right through many of the sessions was this linkage between the climate crisis, economic crisis, and the crisis in care, and how connected they all are. And the reason why that's an issue for gender is that typically women are at the front of that. So, with the extra burden around care, it falls on women, whether that's paid or unpaid. In terms of when they're, struggles with the economy, women are making the decisions in the household in the developing world, maybe less so in the global south. But the point that they were weaving is that the solutions are often can't be either climate or economy or care. You've got to look at it holistically. And in the developing world, the example that they would be giving is in terms of how economy and climate and care interrelate, is that if people are climate migrants where they can't farm in a particular place anymore, and there were examples in the Philippines that were given and other parts of Africa, and they've had to move, the burden goes up then on they've lost their livelihood. Because they were, typically women are doing more work in agriculture. They're doing more in care. And then, it's sort of that once they've actually had to move, that increases that burden because it's, they've sort of had to uproot and try and start again somewhere else.
I mean, it's so interesting, and I think, well, first phrasing it as a care crisis isn't actually something that we've done. I mean, certainly as community business, that kind of made me reflect. I think it's incredibly poignant for Asia. And we obviously know from our own research a few years ago about what a gendered issue caregiving is in this part of the world, as well as the kind of nuanced cultural norms that play into this double burden that women are facing. And maybe it's more than a double burden, actually, listening to what you're saying. So could you share for us a little more about what you learned from partners at the conference, specifically any insights from global partners that might be applicable back to us in Asia?
Yeah, so you know, I mean, it's kind of like, it could feel like real gloom and doom, but what was lovely about the conference was that there was lots of wonderful solutions being put on the table. So there was this absolutely fantastic example of a municipality in the Philippines that's brought in a care ordinance. And what that care ordinance is, so it's essentially like a local council that have acknowledged care as a, care as a role in society and the burden of what that means. And they talk about, it's about recognising and redistributing the care. So what they've actually, it's in a rural area, so I must be at pains to say this is in a rural area, but what they've actually done is they're recognising the care, they're measuring it, and then they're finding ways to redistribute the work. And when I say they're measuring it, they're actually got down to, they know how many hours a day a woman would typically spend pitching water or doing household duties, and they know how many hours a day the average woman is providing care to elder parents or children. And what they've done off the back of that is they've then run a campaign. So they've got ads on the TV, they're doing education programs for the whole family on what that burden of care means and how it should be a family problem to tackle and not always fall to the woman. And what they've done is they're also then doing things like introducing labour-saving devices. So that might be an example that they gave, is they've targeted more areas where they're putting better water services in, or they're providing cooktops so people aren't having to light fires, or they're sort of, and things like washing machines and stuff like that. So where do you apply that? You know, if you sort of try and reflect on how does that sit within a context here, I think the most important message in all of that is the recognition of what's falling on the shoulders of women and girls, as opposed to, and then seeing it as a family problem to fix. And, you know, we've seen campaigns here around men being allies. They're actually talking about male care allies. So allyship in terms of males who are stepping up. And the ad I actually watched was a family environment where the husband and the wife were doing the dishes together. So, you know, I think where it is transferable is in that education.
And I mean, I think, you know, in terms of what we're talking about as wider community business, I can see implications for self-worth, for social mobility, in formalising and understanding what women's unpaid labour is, but making you feel seen is so important. I think.
And I think that's what it was about. It was the acknowledgement of seeing it, and there was more than one group talking about that, and there was a lot about recognition, and you know, who's taking on the recognition, who's got the responsibility, how do you redistribute? So they're quite common models, but it was all about visibility of the problem first, and then educating to change attitudes.
And also, I suppose, the fact that gender and issues for women are similar across the world, across developing, however you look, global north, global south. We have the same conversations over and over, and there might be cultural nuance in it, but women are facing these problems everywhere. It's so interesting, isn't it? And I guess at a global scale, you can see that. You can hear people in Nigeria talking about it. You can hear people in the Philippines talking about it.
Yeah, absolutely.
An insight that sparked my interest when we were talking earlier was that of utilising cultural practice, such as religion, to bring about positive change and drive impact. So could you explain a little bit more about what you learned there?
Yeah, sure. I mean, this one was, for me, not so much challenging, but I guess we work in an environment where we think being secular is the right thing to do. I attended a great session called The Movable Middle, And the discussion there is about, in an increasingly polarised world, how do you meet in the middle so that you're appealing to the majority of people who sit in this sort of middle group, who aren't diametrically opposed as such to more inclusive societies, but they don't see it as their problem. Yeah. There was talk about how like the far right have actually got really good at mobilising the middle, but perhaps in terms of when you're having conversations around inclusivity, that's not something they've necessarily done a good job of. And I guess that, a statistic that kept sticking in my mind, that kept coming up in not just this session but others, is that you've got over 80% of the world who are faith-based. Yeah. So if you are sort of ignoring that as a consideration in terms of how people think and feel and act, then that's a large portion of society where you're not considering what their, how they would view a particular problem. And then if you take that a step further, if you're actually considering people's faith, and culture would be the same, you can use that to bring people together in a safe space to have the right kinds of conversations. So the examples that were given, there are a couple. There was some around where domestic violence has been quite normalised and religion is used to normalise it, and they were able to run Bible study groups and also, use the Quran to point out parts of the sacred text where it's actually not the right way to behave. So they sort of use it and also enlist religious leaders and local leaders who are typically men in that conversation. Similarly, there were cultural practices where they looked at, what's a cultural value that aligns with inclusive practices. So there was an example I heard, not in the same session, but it was an Indian NGO that was presenting on taking Hindu teachings around how women are equals to push forward an agenda around more inclusive practices. So I think that was a really good learning. And I mean, if you think like values like peace, respect, justice and love are consistent through very, very many faiths. Yeah. And when you're talking about inclusivity, that's what you're really talking about. It's things like justice, respect, peace and love. So, there's a lot of alignment there. And I don't have the answer in terms of what that might mean for us, but I do think that it's a lot of what we do in community business is putting that Asian lens on, on inclusion. I think we just need to keep leaning into that, and even using the diversity we've got within our own team around how we do actually put that lived Asian experience over the concepts around inclusion.
Yeah. And actually, I mean, that 80% number sticks with me, because I think if you impose sort of secular values from the start, you're not working with the majority.
No, you're not.
Yeah.
You're not. And if you think about it in terms of our client base, the people who are part of an ERG in a corporate environment have got it.
Yeah.
Right? They're there already. So you can sort of have this echo chamber that's created. It's finding those creative ways to sort of recognise how you meet that person in the middle, because the majority of humans, if they're faith-based, are going to be aligned with decent values and equity and fairness for people. I think that was a bit of an aha moment. Maybe it's something I should have been aware of already, but it just sort of solidified for me the way that we go about what we do, and in terms of absolutely looking at the faith-based and cultural values that fit within the markets that we're working with.
And I mean, I guess it gets me thinking about our research that we did a couple of years ago about religion and culture in India specifically. And, maybe there's scope for us to be looking at that again, thinking about what are the applications and really, digging into it, because I think that conversation is never going to go away.
No.
We're still talking about 80% of the population, right? Okay, so to pivot a little bit, being in a space with so many NGOs must have been incredibly moving. but also given the opportunity to learn more about what we have learned ourselves, that the landscape is incredibly tough and competitive in terms of fundraising and could you share a little bit about what you learned from global partners, what the global conversation is around this, and where people see the future of NGO work?
Yeah, so it was incredibly inspiring, and particularly, we work predominantly with a fairly privileged group of people, and we're fortunate to be in a position to do that. So a lot of I got to see a lot of grassroots work that was amazing and really inspiring to see. And there are some challenges where it's we share with grassroots charities, and the challenges around sustaining our work, and the bottom line around sustainability for an NGO is having the money to do your work. And so in terms of funding models, there was quite a lot of discussion around funders showing up as allies and not supervisors. There are also some funds that are definitely starting to look at multi-year because they've recognised that sustainable change doesn't happen in a calendar or a budget planning year, that it's multi-year, and that's the only way people are going to be effective. So I thought that was quite interesting. In addition, there's also NGOs, and I know here in Hong Kong, it's not just even in Hong Kong, it was a common theme that came out as well, but you often find funders are prepared to fund a program, but just the program, and there's no acknowledgement of the fact that it takes staff to run those programs. So they want the money to be going direct to the communities, which the point that was made by a lot of the grassroots NGOs is that in some respects that's almost exploitative because it's not respecting the NGO worker, that it takes skill and talent and time and people to run these programs out. So, there was a lot of chat about that. There's and the value of ensuring that the NGO work, the workers are valued. A lot of the NGOs were calling on funders to trust the leaders who've got the expertise to do what they do and their knowledge of the local communities that they're working within. There was a grassroots NGO in Zimbabwe that talked about it as the trauma of chasing the money. And they said that, that they understand it's a necessary part of what they do, but they spend, at the leadership team, spend more of their time chasing the money than they do on the programs, which, as I said, it was interesting to hear it described as trauma.
Yeah. And I mean, that brings me back, I guess, to what we talked about at the beginning, which is partnership. Trust, partnership for the goals is about give and take. It is about kind of, I guess, a bit of a leap into knowing that these people know what's happening on the ground. Yeah. But they need the funds to do the work.
Absolutely. I mean, there was quite a bit of commentary in various different sessions on how it can sometimes feel for the NGO that they're driving out programs that are meeting the priorities of the funder and not the communities that they're trying to help. Which is, I guess, a dangerous place to start to go, right? I mean, we all want to be able to fund the work, but they sort of said that the funders that turn up as allies are the ones where they know that they're making the most difference.
Yeah, and I mean, there is a balance, right? You have people you'll have organisations that need to work on what they want to prioritise.
Absolutely.
Servicing them is part of it, but
it wasn't necessarily not having reasonable governance. Everybody understood that there needs to be governance and people need to understand where the funds are going and all of that sort of thing. But it was just kind of I think it was really very much about building the relationship of trust.
Great, thank you. Okay. Bringing what you learned and your trip in general back to us and our mission at Community Business, what would you say the biggest ripple of change we can make is based on what you heard from others at the conference?
Strengthening our partnership so we've got common goals. And really thinking about how do we partner to drive positive change. It's not a competition. So, there's power in working together towards these common goals rather than, sort of feeling like sometimes it's a competitive environment, because certainly the conference at no point felt like a competitive environment. In actual fact, it was quite the opposite. At CB, I think we've always brought that Asian lens to the DE&I agenda. It's just made me more resolute now around how we bring the cultural and faith-based values into that align with, because it's important. It's silly to ignore that.
Yeah.
And then, because I think too for us, it's who are our movable middle. So in all the different markets CB covers, where's that movable middle? And it'll be in businesses.
Yeah.
Like the movable middle in a corporate is most likely the line managers who are in operational roles or sales roles and the like, have got all their targets, and they're not opposed to DE&I, but it's, so how do you appeal to that cohort of people? And then I think just looping back again around respecting the local culture and the faith values, I think by appealing to that movable middle, you start to move away from that echo chamber where we're talking to the same people about the same challenges, and you're actually starting to, I guess, create that ripple effect through where we're starting to just go deeper and wider in getting the message around more inclusive societies.
Great. Well, thank you. We're glad to have you back. Appreciate you sharing.
No worries. Thanks, Emily.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to CB Up for Discussion. For more information about our work across Asia, head to the Community Business website.